Picture this. It is 865 AD inside a Danish longhouse. A messenger has just finished speaking. The silence is absolute, but the violence has already begun. Four brothers sit around a table, the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. Sigurd, snake in the eye, is holding a small knife, idly paring his fingernails. As the news of his father's murder sinks in, he doesn't scream. He doesn't look up. He just keeps cutting, slicing past the nail, through the skin, carving straight down to solid bone. He doesn't even feel it. Across the table, Bjorn Ironside is holding a chess piece carved from bone. His grip tightens. There's a sharp crack. The chess piece explodes in his fist. Shards drive deep into his palm and blood drips rhythmically onto the wooden board. This wasn't grief. This was a declaration of war. This was the exact second the revenge of the Great Heathen Army began. The messengers confirmed that King Aella of Northumbria hadn't just killed Ragnar. He had tortured him. He threw the legendary Viking into a pit of vipers to die slowly, stripped of his armor and glory. Aella wanted to prove that Ragnar was just a man. But with his dying breath, Ragnar laughed. As the venom took hold, he choked out one final prophecy: how the little piglets would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffered. King Aella thought he was ending a threat. In reality, he was lighting a fuse. He forgot that the old boar had sons, and those piglets were now the most dangerous warlords in Europe. The reaction in Denmark was immediate. There were no tears. Only mobilization. They sent out a call that reached every corner of the Viking world. This would not be a raid for silver or slaves. This was a mission with a single brutal purpose: extermination. Warriors flocked to their banner from Norway, Sweden, and Ireland. Rivals put aside old feuds. Mercenaries refused payment just to be part of it. King Aella believed he was safe in his stone fortress across the sea. He had no idea he'd just summoned a force unlike anything England had ever seen. In late 865 AD, sentries on the coast of East Anglia looked out and saw something that stopped their hearts. Usually, a Viking alarm meant 3, maybe 5 longships. But this time, the horizon itself seemed to be moving. Hundreds of dragon-headed prows cut through the mist. This wasn't a raiding party. It was a floating city. A migration of death. Historians call it the Great Heathen Army. It wasn't just warriors. It was smiths, women, children, and horses. They weren't coming to steal silver and leave. They were coming to take the land and dismantle the kingdoms of England brick by brick. At the head of this massive force was not the strongest brother, Bjorn, or the most stoic, Sigurd. It was the cripple, Ivar the Boneless. History has debated for centuries why he was called boneless. The sagas tell us he was often carried into battle on a shield. But make no mistake, Ivar was the brain of the operation. While his brothers were fueled by rage, Ivar was fueled by cold, mathematical cruelty. Ivar knew Northumbria was too strong to attack directly, so he made a move that confused everyone. He landed his massive fleet in East Anglia. He bypassed his target. Why? Because Ivar was playing the long game. He terrorized East Anglia into submission and demanded horses, turning his seaborne infantry into mounted cavalry. He spent the winter gathering intelligence, sharpening blades, and letting the fear of his presence drift north like a plague. He was letting King Aella wait, letting the dread build. By the time the snow melted in 866, the Great Heathen Army was no longer just a mob of angry Vikings. They had become a professional machine of war. While the Great Heathen Army was preparing, the kingdom of Northumbria was destroying itself. King Aella, the man who killed Ragnar, was fighting a civil war against the rightful king, Osbert. They were so consumed by hatred for each other that they didn't notice the shadow creeping from the south. In autumn 866, Ivar made his move. But he didn't just choose the target, he chose the time. He waited for November 1st, All Saints' Day. On All Saints' Day, the entire noble class would be gathered inside cathedrals, unarmed and deep in prayer. They were expecting a feast. What they got was the heathen army. The Vikings struck York while church bells were still ringing. The city's defenses were manned by skeleton crews. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre in a sanctuary. Ivar didn't burn York to the ground. That would be a common raider's mistake. Instead, he occupied it, repaired the Roman walls, and turned York into a Viking fortress deep in enemy territory. He sat on Aella's throne and waited. It took 4 months for the Northumbrians to swallow their pride. Finally, in March 867, King Aella and his rival Osbert shook hands. They combined their forces and marched on York, convinced that God was on their side. On March 21st, Palm Sunday, the Northumbrians attacked. At first it looked like victory. They broke through the gates and poured into the city streets, thousands of them, thinking they had the Vikings on the run. But they didn't understand who they were fighting. Ivar hadn't lost the walls, he had abandoned them. He had invited the English inside. As soon as the bulk of the Northumbrian army was squeezed into the tight, winding streets, the trap snapped shut. Vikings appeared on rooftops. They emerged from side streets. They locked their shields at both ends of the main avenues, turning York into a claustrophobic kill box. In close quarters, the long spears of the English levies were useless. It became a brawl of axes and knives. The Northumbrians were packed so tightly they couldn't swing their weapons. They were butchered where they stood. King Osbert fought bravely but was cut down in the chaos. The crusade had turned into a slaughter. But amidst the carnage, the Vikings had specific orders. There was one man who was not to be killed. King Aella saw his army disintegrate. He realized with dawning horror that the walls he just breached were now his prison. He was surrounded, dragged from his horse, stripped of his weapons, and forced to his knees in blood and dirt. The Battle of York was over. The Vikings didn't execute Aella on the spot. That would have been mercy. Instead, they bound him in chains. The war was finished. The ritual was about to begin. The Blood Eagle. King Aella was dragged into the Great Hall of York. Around him stood the victorious chieftains, but his eyes were fixed on the four men on the dais, the sons of Ragnar. The terrifying presence was the man who couldn't even stand up. Ivar the Boneless lay on furs, his twisted legs useless, but his eyes burning with cold, reptilian intelligence. This was the moment the prophecy came full circle. Aella looked at them and saw the little piglets his prisoner had warned him about. But they were not piglets, they were wolves. Ivar didn't scream. He didn't rage. He spoke softly, asking Aella about the pit, about the snakes. Every question was a knife twist, forcing Aella to relive his crime. Aella had denied Ragnar a weapon to die with. Now Ivar would deny Aella a quick death. There was no negotiation. Ivar signaled to his guards. They dragged Aella to a nearby hill. The sons of Ragnar had decided on a punishment that would echo through history, a method of execution so horrific that for centuries, scholars refused to believe it was even physically possible. They prepared the ground for the Blood Eagle. King Aella was forced onto his stomach, hands and feet staked into the ground. The executioner approached with a long knife. This wasn't clumsy hacking, it was anatomy. First, the skin of Aella's back was sliced open. 2 long curved incisions along the spine. The skin was peeled back like parchment, exposing red muscle and the white cage of ribs underneath. Aella would have been screaming. Then came the hammer and chisel. One by one the ribs were severed from the spine. Crack, crack, crack. The ribs were forced outward, bent back to resemble the spread wings of a bird. The man was being turned inside out. The final act. The executioner reached inside and pulled the lungs out from the chest cavity, draping them over the broken ribs. As the lungs collapsed and fluttered with dying breaths, the movement looked like the beating of wings, a blood-soaked eagle trying to take flight. Aella screamed. He died not as a warrior but as a sacrifice to Odin, his body transformed into a grotesque symbol of Viking dominance. When the deed was done, Aella's body was left there as a warning to every other king in England. The debt was paid. The old boar had been avenged. But as the sons of Ragnar wiped blood from their hands, they realized something. The rage hadn't subsided. Aella was dead, but there were other kings in England. With Aella dead and Northumbria broken, a normal army would have gone home. But the Great Heathen Army didn't turn back. They turned south. In 869 AD they returned to East Anglia. King Edmund had given them horses 3 years earlier, hoping to buy safety. But when the Vikings returned, they didn't ask for horses. They asked for the kingdom. King Edmund was a devout Christian who refused to submit to a pagan overlord. He was captured and tied to a tree. Ivar ordered his archers to fire volley after volley, not aiming for the heart or head but for arms, legs and shoulders. The chroniclers wrote that Edmund was shot with so many arrows he resembled a hedgehog, his body bristling with shafts, bleeding from a dozen non-fatal wounds. Throughout the ordeal, Edmund refused to renounce his faith. Infuriated, Ivar gave the final order. A swordsman stepped forward and severed Edmund's head with a single blow. King Edmund the Martyr died not because he killed Ragnar, but because he stood in the path of the avalanche. By 874 AD, the Great Heathen Army had effectively decapitated 2 of the 4 great kingdoms of England. Next was Mercia. King Burgred looked at the fate of Aella and Edmund, the Blood Eagle and the Hedgehog. He realized these were not men you could negotiate with or beat. So Burgred ran. He took his gold and fled to Rome, dying there in exile. The Vikings didn't even have to unsheathe their swords to conquer Mercia. Fear had done the work. Only one kingdom remained independent, the Kingdom of Wessex in the south. If it fell, England would cease to exist. But in Wessex they found something they hadn't encountered before. Not an arrogant tyrant like Aella, not a passive martyr like Edmund, not a coward like Burgred. They found a young man named Alfred. At this time Alfred was not yet the Great. He was a sickly prince, often overshadowed by his warrior brother. But Alfred possessed a weapon that Ivar respected, a brilliant tactical mind. When the Vikings attacked in 871, Wessex bit back. When Alfred's brother died, Alfred took the crown in the middle of a war zone. He looked at his exhausted army and did the unthinkable. He paid the Vikings to leave. Critics might call this cowardice, but there was a key difference. Alfred paid to buy time. He needed to reform his military, build ships, and study his enemy. As the Vikings took the gold and settled, believing Wessex was pacified, Alfred sat in the dark, watching, planning, and waiting. In 870 AD, after King Edmund's execution, Ivar the Boneless simply vanished from English records. For centuries this puzzled historians. To find the answer we look to the Annals of Ulster, where Ivar reappears as Imar, king of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain. After breaking England's back, Ivar returned to Dublin to rule as an emperor of the north. But the gods are known for their irony. Ivar, the man who engineered the Blood Eagle, who turned cities into slaughterhouses, did not die a warrior's death. In 873 AD, the annals record that Ivar died of a sudden hideous disease. The man whose mind was a weapon but whose body was a burden was finally betrayed by his own biology. Legend offers a different ending. Viking folklore says that before he died, Ivar ordered his body buried on the English coast where Vikings first landed. His prophecy, as long as his bones remained in English soil, no foreign invader would ever successfully conquer England. For 200 years his curse held true. The legend concludes in 1066 when William the Conqueror prepared to invade England. He'd heard the stories. The saga claims William actually found Ivar's burial mound, dug up the corpse, which remarkably had not decayed, and burned it to ashes. Only after Ivar's physical form was destroyed did William feel safe to launch his conquest. When the screams finally faded and the smoke cleared, the map of England had been redrawn forever. The revenge of the Great Heathen Army was complete. They had hunted down every man responsible for Ragnar Lothbrok's death. But revenge is a strange thing. It starts as a fire to burn your enemies, but often ends up forging a new world. The Vikings didn't just kill and leave, they stayed. They traded swords for plows. The lands they conquered became the Danelaw, where Viking laws, customs, and language took root. If you walk through York today or look at place names ending in by or Thorpe, you're looking at echoes of this invasion. Ragnar's death didn't just lead to Aella's death, it led to the hybridization of a culture. The sons of Ragnar had their vengeance, but the question remained, could they hold what they had taken? In the shadow of their victory in the swamps of Wessex, the young King Alfred was done paying them off. He was building the very first English navy, designing a network of fortresses, preparing to do the impossible, to push back the tide. The sons of Ragnar had their vengeance. But the war for the future of England was just beginning.